In this episode, I'll be showing you my abbreviated version of the zone system for shooting black and white photos.
AdoramaTV presents Exploring Photography with Mark Wallace.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on AdoramaTV. I'm Mark Wallace in the city of Puno, Peru, and my altimeter says that I'm just shy of 13,000 feet, and so I'm having a tough time breathing on this very busy street. Well, I was out shooting today with my 5D Mark III, my 24 to 70 millimeter lens, and there is not a cloud in the sky. There is just a lot of shadows and contrast, and that means it's a perfect setup for shooting black and white photos. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode, shooting black and white photos using the zone system that was originally created by Ansel Adams. I'm going to be showing you my abbreviated version, my interpretation of his zone system, specifically on how to do post-production and get really contrasty, dark, moody images. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about the contests that Adorama is hosting right now. They have awesome contests and you can win some great prizes. So click the link and you might win today. Now, when we're shooting black and white photos, we're not actually just shooting black and white. We're shooting black, a bunch of shades of gray, all the way to light gray to white. Now, back in the past when we shot film, there was a system called the zone system that Ansel Adams created, and that system was used for seeing light, for processing negatives, and going into the darkroom to process your prints, so you'd get these really high contrast, beautiful prints. Well, we don't talk much about the zone system these days because, well, film and digital photography are a little bit different. But in this episode, I want to talk to you about my abbreviated version of the zone system. Instead of using 12 stops of light like Ansel Adams did, we're going to use 5 zones. Now, don't send me an email saying this isn't the zone system. I know it's not the zone system, but it's rooted in the zone system. Well, let's talk about those 5 zones of light. Those zones are black, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. Now, to understand all of this stuff better, we really need to dive into Lightroom and take a closer look. So let's do that right now. To get started, let's take a look at those zones again. We have black, our shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. Now, they're not distributed like this in this top bar. If we looked at an evenly distributed from black all the way to white sort of gradient, the blacks really take up just a small portion. They're the very darkest of the grays. Our shadows take up a lot larger portion. The midtones are right in the middle. Our highlights take up another large portion, and our whites really are the very, very edge, the absolute whites. Now, we can actually see these in our develop module on the histogram. So take a look here. You can see it says blacks, shadows, exposure. Now that's midtones, and we'll explain later why that's called exposure in the histogram. And then we have our highlights and our whites. And we can see on the histogram, we actually have spikes here that shows us that this lines up to what our zones are. We have 2 spikes over here in the highlights because we have a highlight here, and then I made this little background that's a little bit lighter, and so that shows up as the second spike. We can also see that these show up here. We've got exposure, or our midtones. We've got highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And we're going to be using these to adjust our images. Now, what we want to do, we have a goal, and our goal is to create high contrast black and white images using these zones to manipulate the tonal values in our images. And we want blacks that are absolutely black, and we want whites that are absolutely white, and we want to adjust everything else according to our artistic vision. The process works like this. First, we adjust our midtones, then we set our black and white points. Next, we adjust the shadows and highlights according to our artistic vision. Then we make color conversion adjustments if we need to. And then last, we do some fine tuning. Well, now that we know the basic steps to our process, let's put those steps into action by editing 3 images. The first image we're going to edit is this color image. We're going to learn how to identify where the different zones are and then convert this to a high contrast black and white image. This will give us the basics of our editing process. The second image is this image of this lock. We're going to do something I like to call zone shifting, where we set our black and whites and our mids, but then we're going to shift some of those shadows and highlight zones into other zones to create a really high contrast, sharp image. And then lastly, we are going to take a look at this image where we shift some of the color conversions to see how color impacts our black and white conversions. It's really important. But let's get started by editing this wall. So I will go over into the Develop module. Now before we get started on this, I want to show you a little trick that Lightroom has for us. So I'm going to open up our chart that we started with. We need a visual cue to show us where the absolute whites and the absolute blacks are when we begin to edit our images. Now to do that, what we can do is there are these little triangles up here in the histogram, and this will show us our clipping. So highlight clipping and our shadow clipping, I just click on that. Anything that's absolutely white will show up as red. Anything that's absolutely black will show up as blue. And I can turn that on and off by hitting the J key or by clicking these little triangles in the histogram. I prefer the J key. And so that will really help us out. All right, so let's get started on this wall here. And the very first thing I want to do is set my midtones. Now to do that, actually the very first thing I want to do is convert this from a color treatment to a black and white treatment. So let's do that right now. Now, the first thing I want to do is to set my midtones. Now, I do that by using the exposure slider. What I can do is if I slide this to the right, my midtone values will increase, and if I slide this to the left, they will decrease. In other words, in luminosity, they'll get brighter or darker. And that way I can say, you know what, do I want this to be my midtone or this to be my midtone? If I want this to be my midtone, well, I need to sort of slide that to the right. If I want this to be my midtone, I need to slide that to the left, sort of bring that into my midtone values. That's the very first thing you want to do, is say where your midtones are, and you get to choose. This is something Ansel Adams was big about, saying you choose where the middle gray is and then work your way out from there. So I want my middle gray to sort of be this bottom area and this door, this bottom door. I don't want to lose a lot of details in the blacks up here where the shadows are and in the door. So I'm going to bring that back pretty close to where it was because I thought we had a pretty good starting point. So right back to 0. In this image, we have a good starting point. All right, next, let's set the black and white points. To do that, I'm going to press J on my keyboard so I can start bringing the blacks down to see where that is showing up. You can see I'm getting a lot of blacks here. I'm going to bring this down so I start seeing blacks not bleeding into the details in the shadow areas because I want to still see that. So I'll bring that down. I think that's about as much as I want to do there because it's starting to impact the door. I want to see those details. Next, I'm going to bring my whites up. You can see on the histogram, we don't have any whites, so I will bring those over to the right, keep going, keep going, keep going. Aha! Now we start to see some white showing up in our image, and that is really giving us a lot more contrast than we started with. All right, now that I have my black and white point set, I will turn off those warning labels, and now I'm going to start working with my shadows. Up here in this corner, we don't really see much in the door. And so what I'll do here is I'm going to take the shadows and shift them to the right to bring them more into the midtone area. And now we're seeing some of those values show up here where we can actually see the details in the door and up here on the wall. And then I'm going to play with the highlights just a bit to bring those down just a hair, maybe a little bit more. So I'm going to see a little bit more of the detail in this wall. And that looks pretty good. Now we might need to do some fine tuning here. One of the things you can do is you can just go into the contrast slider and slide that back and forth or do some sharpening, some things like that. But I think this is a pretty good basic conversion from our color to our black and white image. All right, now that we have sort of the basics down, let's get an image that is more appealing to us. When I was shooting this wall, I noticed that there was this lock on the door that had some really interesting light. And so that's where we're going to go next. So here is our lock. Now this lock, we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of converting to black and white. We're going to do some things. Notice that we can see details across the board here. So we've got shadows here. We can see detail in the upper right-hand side. But I want this to be a super contrasty image. So the very first thing I will do is convert this, again, the treatment to black and white. All right, this is sort of contrasty, but it's not where I want it to be. The midtones are exactly where I want them to be. I like where the midtone values are, so I'm not going to change the exposure slider at all. It's in a good place. But I really want this to be more contrasty, so I'm going to turn on my clipping warnings here, and I'm going to start by taking my blacks way down. So we're going to go all the way down into the 80s, maybe about right there, so 88, 89, in that area. So you can see that I've really taken the blacks down, so we've got a much more contrasty image. but you can see we don't have any whites in this image really. So let's do that next. So I'm going to take my whites and I will keep those going higher and higher and higher until I'm about right there. And I'm judging this based on these red clipping highlights showing up, these little warnings, because I want this to be really contrasty. And you can see immediately that we have a high contrast image, but we lost a lot of detail up here. Our shadows have gone away, our detail on our lock has gone away, and so we need to bring that in. So now let's play with the shadows and the highlights. So the shadows, what I want to do, I want to bring some of that detail back in. So I'm going to say, you know what, shift these to the right about like that. So we're in the 40s, the upper 40s. You can see that we just now are starting to get a little bit more detail up here that was completely black. So we've shifted those shadows from black back into the shadow area. So we've shifted that zone back. The next thing I want to do is play with the highlights here. Now those highlights, what I want to do is I want to take them and I want to go the opposite way. So I want to take the highlights from the highlight area and shift them down into the mid-tone area. So I'm going to go left and shift those down, 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 down. So we're going to take those down into the 50s, about like that. And that is affecting this area right here, making it much, much more contrasty. I really like this. Now, one of the issues though that I'm having is I really wanted to see the detail on that lock. Well, guess what? We can go up here and we can use an adjustment brush in Lightroom. And I'm going to tell it to take my shadows and I'm going to take that all the way up to almost 100. And then I'm going to paint on top of this lock here. And that's shifting those really dark shadows up into almost the mid-tone range. Not quite, but we're getting some of that detail back. And so I'll close that. And you can see we have a really dramatic image. So we went from something that wasn't very contrasty to something that's extremely contrasty. And take a look at that. Let's see if we can look. I saved a little a snapshot here, and you can see where we went from the color image back to where we were there. That is a huge, huge difference. Okay, last but not least, we've got to figure out how color impacts our black and white images. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into this portrait that I made of this gentleman here in Puno. A really great guy. Now, one of the things that happens when you go in and you create a black and white image from a color image is the colors are converted to different luminosities, and by default, Lightroom determines what those color mixes are, and you can see this down here in the black and white mix. And so there's sort of this auto setting that happens automatically. Now, we can't go into great detail into that in this episode, but I did an episode on it. It's Digital Photography 1-on-1, episode 232, How Color Influences Black and White Photography. I really suggest that you watch that. But let's take a look here. If we go over here, there's this little dot, and I can click on that. And when I do, I get this special icon, and then I can click on an area in the image, and I can make it darker or brighter. What I'm doing is I'm adjusting the luminosity of the orange in my conversion, and by doing that, I am making this guy's face darker or brighter. And so maybe sometimes, and we'll go in here and I'll click this auto conversion, you can see that this is sort of a dull image, but I can click on his face, I can bring that up, I can click on the background, I can bring that down. I can do all kinds of things. I can make his coat a little bit darker, and I can get a much, much better conversion by playing with this mix of colors in my black and white mix. Again, make sure you look at episode 232 of How Color Influences Black and White Photography for more information on this. But don't forget that that is available because you can really make a big difference to your black and white images. All right, there you go. All the different steps for converting images from color to black and white using the zone, the abbreviated zone system, and some color conversion. Well, I hope this video helped you with your post-processing of black and white images. I just want to mention that this video doesn't include everything that we could possibly talk about black and white photography, but I have some more videos at the Adorama Learning Center that will help you with this topic, specifically 50 Shades of Black about processing the different midtones and shadows and blacks in an image, understanding stops if that's new to you, and a bunch of other videos. So make sure you check out the Adorama Learning Center for more information, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of Exploring Photography or any AdoramaTV video. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you again next time.
great-looking prints at low cost? Be sure to visit our easy-to-use online printing service. Adorama Pix has professionals who treat your images with the utmost care that you can count on. For a quick turnaround on photos, cards, or albums, use AdoramaPix.com.